Pushing on into Narnia, I'm going to dovetail what I'm about to say now with the lectures that I did in the first night on the planets. Of course, I went kind of real helter-skelter through that material, and that lecture, as well as the lecture on the Hobbit, just to kick off the course, horses, yeah, there you go, was a carrot on a stick for you at the time. It was saying, okay, maybe you've read these books, maybe you haven't, here's what you might have missed, kind of a thing. And the planets bit, I gave you some of the motifs that you do see in the literary structure of the book, things like kingship and festivals and joy with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or some of that bit about water with the planet Venus and the Silver Chair, etc. What I want to do now is actually go through the books, again, piece by piece, and do more of an analysis, or more of a couple of comments, rather, on the Christian themes that Lewis, in particular, is drawing out in each of the Narnia books. Because it's one thing to say, okay, there's the planets, and here's a theme from the planets that is woven into the style that Lewis is writing about, or some of the themes. But it's another thing to say that equals Christian theology. Lewis actually does a fair amount of Christian theology in the Narnia series. A couple of things about it that I didn't mention before that can kind of flesh it out. People sometimes occasionally ask, where does he come up with the name Narnia? Narnia comes from an ancient map that he saw when he was a student of Kirkpatrick's, and he saw this ancient map of Italy. And there, right in the middle, was an old city. Technically, it still exists. Not technically, it still exists. And it is a small little city of Narnia in Italy. Now, Lewis says, I chose that name just because I liked it. I thought it sounded good. There's no metaphor or allegory of the fact that he chose an Italian city in the middle of nowhere. It was just a name that stuck out to him. So that's Narnia. It's born of a couple of different impulses in his thinking. He does say that at the age of 16, again, not yet a Christian, he had a kind of imaginative impression of a faun walking around on hooves with an umbrella. And as a child and a lover of fairy tales, he thought that was quaint or cute or whatever you want to call it. He thought, that's an interesting story. And the phrase he actually writes in a letter is, let's try to make a story out of that. Yeah.
This is a dumb question, but I have to ask. In Narnia, Italy, are there wizards?
There has to be people that go to the city of Narnia in Italy and walk around with, horse from the waist down. Yeah, you got to think so, right? That's right. Yeah, if they go to yeah, I wish I did have pictures. I should look that up. If they go to Tolkien's woods and dress up like wizards and LARP around, then you got to think they do something in Narnia, Italy. If I win the lottery, I'll buy a house there and go find out. Or do it myself. No, kidding. But he has this impression of a faun with an umbrella, and he says, let's try to make a story out of this. Again, this is him as a young man. He doesn't actually write any of the story. He just kind of lets his imagination run wild. Later, as a Christian, he says the Aslan character came sort of crashing into his imagination. This idea that he could use Aslan as a case in point of Christ. Not actually Christ, but as a story in and of itself that is illustrative, that gives an illustration of the love of Christ. The other thing is that seemed to have jogged his imagination and got his imagination rolling was that during the war, as the stories begin with the first publication, which was Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the story begins, of course, of children that are shipped off because of the bombing during World War II. This actually happened to Lewis in his home. When he lived in Oxford, in the home that is now called the Kilns, which, again, if you ever go to Oxford, you can go see it, as essentially a museum for Lewis. At one point during the bombing of London, 3 little girls came to stay with him, arranged somehow through either friends or something like this, Margaret, Mary, and Catherine. And let's not kid ourselves. Lewis's love for fairy tales is about how adults ought to read them as well. There was something about seeing these little girls scared from the war, scared of the bombing, kind of lost and very innocent in a way, living for a time in his home, that just awoke something in him to sort of develop this story. And then I say here at the bottom, of course, that the lion, as he called him forever, that Aslan was this sort of almost, again, he said, crashed into his imagination. He said, in other words, he says, I didn't sit down and say, what's a good idea for Jesus? Oh, a Lion of Judah. And he didn't go that way. But rather, it's a fertile imagination. It just simply kind of bubbled up. And he found it compelling, this character of Aslan, as a voice in the story itself about children that can preach gospel messages within it without being overtly all the time just a simple metaphor or analogy for the gospel. And I think you'll see that as we go through. I'm going to progress through these stories in the order of their publication, because I think that might lay out something. Again, if you buy a modern edition, you're going to get the books in chronological order. That is because later on he wrote books that are prequels, etc. But I'm going to go through them in publication history. Yeah, you get both sides. I do think if you read him in the order you published him, you get more of an unfolding of his style and his writing and maybe some of his themes. You know, even the prequel, where Diggory goes back, you know, it's sort of a back in time kind of thing. As you'll see, I don't think is all necessarily about the beginning of creation. I'll get there in a second. I do think the publication history is a fair way to read it. Yeah, because it also at least wakes you up to the fact that he started with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you can almost tell he started as a one-off tale, and then he goes, "I'll keep going," and he develops others. Yeah, so I think that could work, particularly if you haven't read it. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I say it's not a pure allegory. Lewis himself says this. The key word in this sentence is pure. It's allegorical. It has clear allegories. I mean, come on. Aslan dies and comes back to life and defeats Satan. I mean, it's got some allegory there, but it's not a pure allegory. He is purposely putting all kinds of things in it, and not only that, but he is purposely focusing on the fact that the story is independent of reality. He, as I'll show in a bit, he actually says this in one or two places in the books, that the stories are stories, they are not actual reality. And that Aslan, in a few points, says, hey, when you get back to the real world, he doesn't call it the real world, but he says, when you get back to your place, you have to find me truthfully there. That it's not enough just to have a story about a lion who dies for you. But again, more on that in a minute. But it's not a pure allegory. The best language that secondary sources have started to use, or at least one major secondary source, is he says that Aslan is a case in point of the gospel story. That it's certainly gospel focused, gospel colored, gospel strengthened, whatever you want to use, but that he's not trying to comport his story entirely with the Gospels, but rather, again, in that echoing sense. He wants his story to echo the Gospel in a meaningful, authentic way, but in a way that also just lets the story be a story. And therefore, he doesn't have to connect it with all doctrinal or scriptural fidelity. It is, as I say here, it's purposely obvious, yet it's also not identical to the Gospels. It's purposely obvious what he's talking about, but he's also saying, I'm not trying to be purely identical. So in other words, I said in the last lecture, this is something I'm always cautioning myself is just because it's in his fiction, it's not in his metaphysics. Meaning just because he puts it there doesn't mean he thinks this is exactly how it happens. So sometimes people get a little sniffy about his concept of a deeper magic before the foundation of the earth as the thing that tricks Satan, or the white witch, I should say, into sacrificing him, all this kind of stuff. People go, boy, his atonement theory is really screwed up. It's like, actually, it might just be the story component that he's added into it. Because he actually, in his nonfiction, writes about the atonement and has things to say about it over there, which he doesn't bring up anything about deep magic, all this kind of stuff. In other words, you always have to remind yourself, this is him telling a story, Even when he writes himself into the story, it's kind of a waving his arms. I'm just writing a story here, guys, and all of these elements of Aslan as Jesus are vehicles, you might say, of communicating gospel truth, but that truth is located outside of the story. It's just that the story is faithful to it at times. So that's a big one. Of course, the deeper magic issue is what we call ransom theory. This idea, if you've had Church History 1, we talk about it a bit, this idea that Satan somehow owned us and that Christ's work on the cross was to buy us back from Satan. Well, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe seems to teach this, and it seems to be that this is what Lewis thinks. But again, I don't think that is necessarily the case. I think it's just part of the story that he's telling in that literary sense. The main theme, though, is a rescue from God, that God is the rescuer, that we have subjugated ourselves to something, sin or the devil, and that God himself, Aslan in this case, is the rescuer. And alongside that, as I point out, it's that God is kingly, that his authority is good and it should be followed. Again, I think Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, its main theme is sin and redemption. It's obviously, its main theme is redemption, restoration, joy. Christ is king, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Rescue from God. You mean like God is the rescuer, not the rescued from him.
Yes. Yeah, this should be a subject in the sentence. We are rescued from God. No, by God. Yeah. Now you got me confused. Rescued by God, but the sentence here is that the rescue comes from God. There we go. Yeah, no. Yeah, good clarification. Get away from me, God. No. Rescue by God, but that the rescue comes from God is the point of that sentence. Yeah. Prince Caspian is interesting. It's the one that is related to the planet Mars, as we mentioned in the planet section of the lectures. And what is in play here is this idea that the children return to Narnia after, in Narnia timeline, about 1,000 years, and Narnia lies in ruin. Lewis, actually, at a later date, a young girl wrote him a letter asking him questions about this book. He wrote her back, and he actually says very, very explicitly here that the book is about, quote, the restoration of the true religion after a corruption. And that is, in his mind, the main theme. Now, again, if you read it in publication order, as Joey asked, you go from very explicit redemptive themes to, I find that's where people go, I don't get it. Okay, who's who in this? And they try to allegorize everything. But by his own admission, this book is a thematic, theological comment about restoration after a corruption of the faith. But it's not allegorized in the full sense. Again, it's a case in point of restoration. And so the theme in that book is the corrosive nature of the enemies of the faith, how they twist and pervert, how they sort of insinuate themselves amongst people of God and try to convince them to think otherwise about the faith. And that eventually the people of God move to a point, sometimes historically and certainly biblically at times, to the point where they believe false gods, or they follow the will of their heart, this kind of thing, and then there's a restoration. And so Prince Caspian is primarily focused on that. Its warrior themes, in other words, are not violence for the sake of violence, but rather a metaphor, you might say, of the struggle to return the faith to its proper biblical foundations, which kind of exonerates Lewis from putting all these kids in a battle and having them kill things. The idea here is, again, is of a struggle that is a metaphor for contending for the faith, we might say. Voyage of the Dawn Treader. This is very classically a traditional voyage tale. This type of story is told repeatedly in traditional, pagan, even Christian sources. It's almost ubiquitous. The voyage tales, a band of a crew or a band join a vessel and go on this tour or this quest. So in that sense, he's doing some traditional imagery. I think that's highlighted by the fact that towards the end of the book there are these mer people. Again, classic tropes on you're on a voyage, you find the mermaids deep in the waters of the ocean, and it's part of the plot. There is no element here of necessary allegory. Who are the mer people? I know. They're the Aryans, this kind of thing. No, what he's doing is he's saying that he's sort of wrapping his themes within this traditional voyage tale. And what is, I think, one of the main sub-themes, or at least even obvious themes, is conversion to Christianity. And that is because of the story of Eustace. Eustace is very, very clearly at the beginning of the story a bad seed, kind of a bully, one of those kinds of guys. And through the course of this journey, he ends up coming back. And if you go to the last chapter, it says that people say of Eustace, I don't recognize him anymore. He acts so differently. And there's one stray line in it that I think is particularly obvious, which is Eustace's mother says that he is now boring and dull, which is a very common sort of non-Christian response. Oh, you're a Christian now. Oh, you've gone so dull on me. You're just going to sit around and go to church all day, this kind of thing. And there is this sense in which Eustace, through this journey, that this voyage motif, is one maybe of the gospel sort of penetrating into Eustace so that by the time he goes back, he is a different person. That there's change afoot in his life. And here's another one of the interesting things. It's in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Aslan, again, it's book 3 in the publication order. So you get the sense that C.S. Lewis is kind of pulling people's imaginations back, because at the end, Aslan gives this comment about his relationship to the story and his relationship to the real world. He says, "I am in your world," said Aslan. He's talking to Eustace. "But there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there." That sentence, that little phrase by Aslan is, I think, the rubric for understanding Narnia itself. It's, I'm bringing you into a story for a little while, and you'll get these glimmers of biblical truth. You'll get a sense of Christ through just a story, but that he says, you have to know me out there in the real world. You have to actually get to know Jesus. It's not enough just to like Aslan. Aslan is a glimmer, it's an inkling, is that word, a little glimmer of the truth of who Christ is. And again, I think that sentence, that little phrase there is the way you should read the Narnia series. Silver Chair, of course, another quest story. This time over land, under mountains, all those kinds of things. What's interesting about this story, thematically, is that the story itself is a planned rescue of Prince Caspian's son, who's been strapped to a silver chair and kind of held captive, this kind of a thing. I think that is just part of the story itself. I don't think there's necessarily an allegory or a metaphor there. necessarily. I think the main metaphor, the main thing Lewis is trying to get us to focus on is this quest, specifically because of this move, this sort of story of follow the signs. I will give you signs to follow me from beginning until end. Follow them and don't get lost. Of course, they immediately start to forget every sign that he's given them, and they get lost in the journey, which I think is fundamentally faith in modern times. This idea that a journey started well, a journey started with where Christ giving us very clear signs, know me here, see me here, follow the promises, the signs of God. And of course, signs is, in historical and systematic theology, is very, very much about worship. The signs of the gospel promise, the Lord's Supper itself, baptism, the sacraments, all these things are considered signs of the faith, these kinds of things. But what happens again is they have this planned quest for life, and that at times they have forgotten the signs, even though they were spoken so clearly by Aslan. Follow these 4 things. They're easy to remember. And here's the line from Aslan. Pay no attention to appearances, remember the signs, and believe the signs. That's actually again, Lewis knows he wouldn't put stray words in there. Believe the signs. That's faith language. It's trust what I am telling you on the path of life. He says nothing else matters. And of course, what's interesting about the story is they bungle it repeatedly, and yet Aslan still carries them through to the end and gets them on the quest doesn't falter because of their inability to follow even the simplest of rules along the way. So there's a significant concept of grace and being carried and followed and watched by Aslan along the way. Horse and his boy. Again, I mentioned that this is the planet Mercury. There's the mercurialness. It's kind of opaque at times. But the Christian themes in it, I don't think are all that necessarily complicated. What is in play here is the extraordinarily forgotten, too often, biblical concept that God is the Lord of the nations. That even though he has a particular people, and even though he loves his people with an undying love, and even though he has saved and rescued his people, and not the world in a universalistic sense, that God repeatedly reminds Israel and reminds the New Testament church, I am the God of the nations. I am the God of the nations. The Jonah story alone is illustrative of the fact that God says, you think you're a prophet only for Israel? I actually have my eye on the world. And so that's one of the major themes, this idea that God, that he is the Lord of nations. The other big one is there is a steady, constant critique of the concept of luck. It really winds up at the end, but as you read the story, there's this sense that there's a lot of lucky turns and breaks for Shasta, and that he just barely makes it at times. And then at the end, and this is usually how providence is glimpsed, by the way, at the end of a long journey, Aslan stands there and says, yeah, all those things you thought were luck were me. All those moments of safe providence and safe journeying were me. And again, it's a very open critique of this idea that luck carries you through at any point. It's God's providence. It's his care. It's his fatherly. It's the fact that not a hair falls from your head that he isn't aware of it, that kind of a thing. There's no luck involved in that pagan sense. And in the end, God's love and grace. Yeah. Could be Shasta and Nicodemus. I could see some of those moves. There's been a lot of people trying to figure out Shasta's relationship to a biblical character. Some have seen him as Abraham. Abraham was a wild pagan in the land of Ur, called out to follow God, those kinds of things. Some have said Moses, similarly. He's a good old Egyptian boy, called out to follow God, these kinds of things. I can't help but think that he hasn't picked... I think he's being a little more Old Testament here, in the ancient Near Eastern world. I don't necessarily personally think that he's doing a whole lot of sort of modern critique of Islam or something like that at this point.
It reads just like Shakespeare.
That's actually an interesting point. I didn't even consider that. Shakespeare and The Horse and His Boy.
Listen to the language.
You're right, because Shakespeare is the king of that type of comedy, misunderstood
I think
identities.
His fight is that Shakespeare comedic hero.
Mm.
Read it under that lens.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to and particularly since Lewis, Tolkien would never have gone Shakespearean, but Lewis did. He has one of his expertise. That's an interesting thing.
Part that they talk to their asides about the plan. Oh, and then we're going to do this at nighttime. And the language is completely different.
Right, now you make me want to go reread it. Jerk. You're a jerk. Okay. And God's love and grace. This idea that I mean, again, if you want to sort of call it, I think Shasta doesn't come to a position of what we would call faith until the end of the story. And it's at the end, after he has submitted to Christ, that Christ says, hey, all those places you weren't serving me, I was still following and serving and supporting and loving you and giving you grace. It's a concept of prevenient grace, not in the Wesleyan sense, but in the sense that grace that goes before, up to the conversion. I'm sorry, you see Lewis's biography, this idea of God there all the way through, and then he comes in, he thinks, kicking and screaming until he submits himself to the love that's there. It's got a little bit of him in it. The one that has the most of him in it, though, is Magician's Nephew. It is almost utterly autobiographical. And this goes back to what I was just saying before to you, Joey, which is, if you read it in this order, here's the thing. If you take The Magician's Nephew and you stick it on the front, you're led to believe that what we have is a full allegory of biblical history. So you have to start with the creation of the world, then you get to redemption, and then the rest is, sanctification or something. I think this book is more about conversion than creation, in an autobiographical sense. Let me remind us of the story, if you haven't read it, or at least give you the big themes. Diggory, of course, goes into the world of Narnia. This is pre any of the previous stories. And he uses a set of rings, magic rings, to release her by accident. He then brings her back into his world, where she begins to wreak havoc on things. He then has to use the rings to put her back into the story and get her out of his life, out of the physical world. And then, at the end of it, he witnesses and finds the extraordinary beauty of the creation of the world by God. For me, when I read that, what I find more, and of course there is the whole bit about the mom needing to be healed. Nothing more autobiographical than that. But for me, I would rather read that narratively, not chronologically or in relationship to other books. Read it as that book. Because what I think is going on here is Lewis is saying, I went into a world with magic rings, and if magic rings don't jump out to you at this point, they should. Magic rings are used historically in all kinds of pagan mythological language. Tolkien wasn't the first to come up with magic rings as something that you can use in a fairy tale. They were very, very common. What I have found as I keep rereading it, Lewis is saying, magic rings, witches, these fairy tales. I got into the stories and then I brought them into my life, almost literally. In this sense, they became my life, and then they wreaked havoc, and I had to put them back into just the story. And then the end result is he witnesses and succumbs to the beauty of the actual true creation of God. I think it's more conversion motif. Of course, he sticks he talks about maybe what he's saying about the restoration of his mother could be eschatological. That because his mother was a Christian of some kind. Lewis never comments too much on it. But in other words, it's surprising to me that when you get into just the story, again, bracket out the other books, it feels very autobiographical. It feels like what Lewis is saying is, this is what I did. I got into the stories, and I brought these elements into my world unnecessarily, and then I later submitted myself to Christ. I do think whenever Lewis is talking about, say, the problem of pain, which of course he wrote a book on, or when he's talking about suffering and grief, I think he always has an interesting perspective, because he does talk about his own grief and he talks about his own suffering, but he always seems to, in that sense, he always does seem to describe it and discuss it in a way where he has witnessed it very close. If you ever go around a hospital chaplain, ask them about suffering, and they will have a great number of poignant, profound things to say, I think. I think Lewis is, I don't have much more to say than that, but I do think Jane's Moore's sort of end of her life was pretty traumatic in terms of the pain. Yeah. I don't think so. Yeah. But by the end of Jane Moore's life, Lewis is once she's quite old, Lewis has pushed away emotionally, sort of closed off. Yeah. No, I think he's just the classic fairy godmother kind of thing. Lastly, the last battle. I don't think I have to tell you what the main themes of this are, though I do want to nuance it slightly. The last battle, of course, refers Armageddon, eschaton, the end, and it plays up this concept of the victory from defeat motif. The last battle itself doesn't go quite well, which is again why I don't think he's actually trying to sum up the book of Revelation. I think what he's getting at is, again, not chronologically in terms of biblical history, like, hey, here's how it's going to happen, but rather, here's a motif that happens until the end, which is God's people seem to be defeated, seem to be oppressed, seem to be pushed down, seem to be attacked and assaulted, and yet the victory is always snatched from that ultimate defeat. This idea of the church, the gates of hell notwithstanding it. By the way, the classic preacher's line, that verse does not say the gates of hell attack the church. It says the church assaults the gates of hell. The idea that the church is progressing and striving and fighting against the evil one. I think, in other words, that what the last battle is showing us is what we call a teleos, a goal. If you haven't had Greek or you're not in that track for languages, of course, the teleos concept is that you are here. And what ends up happening is that in the telos, or the teleos, is this point that becomes the anchor point that pulls you into the future. And in our sense, it's the resurrection of Christ, in that he has the first fruits of the resurrection and the glory, and that he has given it to us in part, that we already have it, but there is yet to come, more to come for us in the eschaton, or the end. In other words, Lewis doesn't care about, are you rapture, are you dispensational, are you amil? He doesn't go towards that end, but I think the last battle is saying until the end, it always follows the pattern of a great battle. The church seems at times to be under hot pursuit and about to lose, but the victory is always the Lord's, or always to God's people. And in other words, the teleos is the thing that gives your life meaning. It's the thing that pulls you forward. It's the motivation in the future, not the push from the back in the Christian life. And I could say just one quick thing about that. I'm getting increasingly alarmed at the constant phrase of take your sins to the cross, take your sins to the cross, sit at the cross, sit at the cross, sit at the cross. I'm not anti-cross, don't worry about that. But what I'm saying is this concept that you go nail your problems and lay your things at the foot of the cross, or you nail your sins to the cross, is emphatically unbiblical. They already have been nailed to the cross. And what I've started to say to people is go to that empty tomb first, or after that. Go to the cross, worship, go to the empty tomb. Because the empty tomb, to go back to this concept, is this idea that Christ has been resurrected. The cross wasn't the last step. He is resurrected. He has now ascended on high, and he is now enthroned. And it is only literally a matter of time before he returns and sets all things aright. And that which we have as a foretaste now becomes the full feast of the Messiah. That I think, now what I just said there, I'm not pinning all that on the book, but I do think that this is more where Lewis is going. This idea of a struggle for life until the end. That there is always this battle theme. And I think that one of the indicators in the story of this is that he says, it is said at the end of the book, that this story is, quote, just the beginning. That actually he says that the story of the kingdom is just the beginning, and he says it's a story, quote, in which every chapter is better than the one before. Again, tipping his cap to the fact that these are stories. This is not trying to encapsulate all of God's truth or even describe what will happen historically at the end of time, but rather he's saying these are just kind of little narratives, little vignettes of the gospel and of the truth of God's message, and that to the extent that we feel some identity with what's being said in the books, we need to know that that's just a story. The Christian life extends into actual space and time.